The following presentation is brought to you by Chut HaM'shulash and, above and beyond, an Israel-registered public benefit charitable corporation. Additional information and links to our website can be found below. This presentation discusses the evolution and corruption of a New Testament English verse translation. All right, for this edition, we're going to be discussing this evolution and corruption of a New Testament English verse translation by quoting from Yishaiyahu chapter 53, verse 9, and the King's English translation of that passage in 1 Peter 2:22, which attributes a very specific quality about the Mashiach, namely that he was a person, quote, who committed no sin, end quote. This verse, amongst others, has led millions of Christians over the centuries to believe that the Mashiach was a sinless human being, that at no time did he ever commit any kind of sin whatsoever during his entire lifetime. He was entirely perfect in every way, according to Christian tradition. Even though he was human, he had no sin whatsoever, and that quality is important to Christianity for many reasons we won't go into in this particular presentation. Nevertheless, no other human being has ever lived since the beginning of mankind upon the earth who has ever been able to achieve this goal of perfection, to live without sinning. But is this really what the prophet Yishaiyahu actually recorded in his prophetic words? Let's take a look. Speaking of the servant of God in that passage, Isaiah 53:59, which, by the way, was written some 500 to 700 years before the Common Era, we read the words in Hebrew, Alo chamas asa. Alo chamas asa. If we translate these Hebrew words into English directly, we get a translation of, for this he performed no violence. He wasn't a violent man. He performed no acts of violence. Now, 350 to 550 years later, after Isaiah wrote those words, somewhere around 150 years before the Common Era, the Septuagint Greek comes along and translates the Hebrew text into Greek for Isaiah 53:9. And there we see the words in Greek, oti anomian uk episein. In these words, when translated, closely match the original Hebrew idea and understanding, and thus the New King James Version reflects that understanding in its English translation by saying, he had done no violence. However, 210 years to 230 years later, right around 60 to 80 of the Common Era, Kepha, meaning Peter, he arrives on the scene and he writes his first letter, and perhaps he wrote it in Hebrew, we don't really know. Perhaps he wrote it in Greek. No one really knows for sure, and also the exact date remains in dispute. But the only versions that survived were Greek versions and many different fragments of Greek versions, which we have with us to this day. Apparently, Kepha, writing in Greek, paraphrases the Septuagint Greek by using these words, os amartian ok episein. And because he used the word amartian, the New Testament New King James justifies its English translation of he committed no sin. But note what happened. The Septuagint uses the word anomian, but the Greek New Testament uses the word amartian. In this way, one word replaced another. Whereas anomian has the connotation of violence or lawlessness, amartian has the connotation of sin. So in the one case, in the Septuagint, he was a man without violence, without violent behavior. In the New Testament, he's a man without sin, which is an entirely different understanding. Now, 1800 years later, in 1877, a man named Franz Delitzsch, a German Lutheran theologian and Christian Hebraist, he came onto the scene. He held a professorship of theology in a very prestigious Protestant university in Germany by the name of Rostock until about 1850. He went on then to teach in the Protestant University of Erlangen in Germany until 1867, and then finally ended up at the Lutheran University of Leipzig in Germany until his death in 1890. Delitzsch was best known for his translation of the New Testament into Hebrew in the year 1877, which was written for the sole purpose of being utilized to convert Jews to Christianity. Today, it's circulated and read in Israel in about 20% of all Messianic congregations. When he arrived at this passage, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, he back-translated the Greek. And in his Hebrew version, he only changed one word when compared to the original Hebrew of Isaiah 53:9. He changed the preposition al to asher. And thus, his version read, his New Testament Hebrew edition read for this verse, asher lo Hamas asa. Not a real big difference. When rendered into English, simply means for which he, again, performed no violence or acts of violence. Now, 100 years later, in 1977, the Israel Bible Society comes along. They open their doors as a nonprofit organization devoted to translating and publishing and distributing the Bible throughout Israel and advocating its credibility, of course, to Israeli society as a whole. This Bible Society was managed and run by evangelical Messianic Jews, Baptists, and other Christians, and their published goal on their website is to, quote, bring the life-changing word to the people of Israel so that they might know the Messiah of Israel. And so in 1970, they began a project of translating the New Testament into modern Hebrew, something that had not existed until that point. All we had was Delitzsch, and Delitzsch was a more poetic form of Hebrew, a higher Hebrew, kind of like the King James would be against, let's say, the New International Version. And so they undertook this project to put a modern Hebrew version into circulation. That project took them 7 years, and in 1977, the first modern Hebrew New Testament was printed in Jerusalem. Today, it's circulated more widely than the Delitzsch, and it's read in Israel in perhaps 80% of all Messianic congregations. Now, when the translators of this new modern Hebrew translation arrived at 1 Peter 2:22, here's how the Yishaiyahu passage was represented in Hebrew. They wrote, Hu asher chet lo asa, changing two less important words, but one very important word. They changed Hamas to chet. Hamas means violence. Chet actually means sin. It's the Hebrew word for sin. So when you render that into English, you get he who committed no sin, hu asher chet lo asa. Well, that's an entirely different understanding than what the original Hebrew text tells us by the pen of Yishaiyahu. Well, the modern New Testament Hebrew translators broke a cardinal rule. They literally altered the original Hebrew text of Yishaiyahu when it was quoted in 1 Peter 2:22. This is something which is forbidden for Jews to do whenever they copy Hebrew text from the Bible. In the original version, Alo Hamas Asa, for which he performed no violence, he was not a violent man, became he committed no sin. Well, clearly the prophet's view of a human Mashiach, which was also held by Kepha, does not match the modern message that the English Christian Bibles have been telling us all of these years. And so a proper rendering of 1 Peter 2:21-22 should therefore look something like this. Picking up the context and the flow from the previous verse, verse 21, Mashiach, who performed good deeds, left behind for us an example, so that we might follow in his steps. And then continuing his quote, quoting from Isaiah 53:9, for which deeds he had not been engaged or involved with any acts of violence. He was not a violent man, nor had deception ever proceeded out from his mouth. That's our lesson for this edition. Thank you for joining us.